At 2:26 a.m. November 13, Captain Hoover of Helena, the senior undamaged cruiser, ordered all ships that could move to retire via Sealark Channel. Only San Francisco, Juneau, and 3 destroyers were able to comply, and at 11 a.m. submarine I-26 sank Juneau, taking down almost 700 men, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. A bloody postscript, this, to the most desperate sea fight since Flamborough Head, recalling Anglo-Dutch battles of the 17th century, when each side slugged the other until all but one went down. Ship losses were fairly well balanced: 2 American light cruisers and 4 destroyers as against 2 Japanese destroyers, and a battleship so badly damaged that airmen could sink her next day. But the Japanese bombardment mission was completely frustrated. Yamamoto admitted as much by relieving Admiral Abe and depriving him of any further sea command. Callahan, on the other hand, completed his mission. He had saved Henderson Field from a bombardment which would have been more serious than those of mid-October, and would certainly have stopped the American air operations, which next day disposed of 11 troop-laden transports. Thus, in the end, mistakes were cancelled out by valour. Let none deny praise to those who fell that bloody night, with 2 great seamen and gallant gentlemen, Daniel J. Callahan and Norman Scott. Dawn rose on a glassy metallic sea, stippled by the floating litter of death and destruction. The mountains of Guadalcanal turned to purple and then to lush green. Sailors on crippled warships of both nations stood or slept by their remaining guns, grimly aware that between ship and ship no quarter would be given. 8 damaged ships, 5 of them American, were visible between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. Atlanta had edged painfully over to Kukum and landed her survivors, but she was past saving and had to be scuttled. Each side now prepared for another night action. Admiral Kondo, who had been cruising off Ontong Java, pushed south with his yet uncommitted heavy cruisers and destroyers to gather up battleship Kirishima and cover a Super Tokyo Express commanded by Rear Admiral Tanaka, composed of 11 destroyers escorting 11 troop-laden transports. Admiral Kinkaid's carrier Enterprise and 2 new battleships were boiling up from the south, Big E ringing day and night with hammer blows and the sputter of welders' arcs to repair the forward elevator. Kinkaid decided that the best thing he could do for the cause was to fly off 9 Avengers and 6 Wildcats to beef up General Geiger's air forces on Guadalcanal and to do what good they could en route. They found Hiei limping along north of Savo Island and got 2 torpedoes into her, proceeded to Henderson Field, refueled, picked up some Marine Dauntless dive bombers, and this time made the battleship go dead in the water. B-17s from Espiritu Santo added an egg or 2 to the collection, and at about 6 p.m. she plunged stern first. Hiei was the first enemy battleship to be sunk by American forces. That night the Americans on Guadalcanal were subjected to heavy bombardment by 2 heavy cruisers which Admiral Mikawa had sent down from Rabaul. As 14 November dawned, airmen, ground crews, and stranded sailors rolled out of their foxholes, and Henderson Field warmed up to one of the busiest days in its hectic history. The first strike holed a retiring light cruiser and heavy cruiser Kinugasa, which bombers from the deck of Enterprise then sank. American airmen, both land and carrier-based, now concentrated on Tanaka's transports that were barreling down the slot. In a series of bold attacks, they succeeded in sinking 6 transports with all their supplies, but Tanaka the Tenacious refused to retire. He pressed on to Guadalcanal with 4 destroyers and 4 big transports. These landed their troops before dawn by running onto the beach, whence the ships never got off, but Tanaka and his destroyer escort scampered safely back to Shortlands. 7 more destroyers, which he had detailed to rescue survivors from the sunk transports, picked up almost 5,000 men and carried them to safety. As the 3rd day of this almost continuous naval battle came to an end, orders were given which led to another night action. Kinkaid, as Halsey had planned, detached battleships Washington and South Dakota and 4 destroyers from Enterprise's screen to thrust into Iron Bottom Sound and clean up. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, officer in tactical command of this group, knew exactly how to handle battleships and had studied how to make the best use of radar. Coming south to meet him was Admiral Kondo in Otago, with the yet undamaged Kirishima, another heavy and 2 light cruisers, and more destroyers under Tanaka, bent on delivering the heavy bombardment on Henderson Field that Abe had been ordered to perform, but Callaghan had prevented. Kondo, whom Commander Hara describes as the British gentleman sort of man, had missed chances in the previous battle, but had been kept in as a favourite of Yamamoto. After this battle, he was out. At 10:15 November 14, Admiral Lee entered Iron Bottom Sound by the Northern Passage. A first quarter moon was shining. Lookouts could pick up looming heights on every side, and shore outlines appeared on radar screens, but neither eyes nor radar discerned any trace of enemy. A rich odour like honeysuckle floated out from the land over the calm waters, a pleasant change from the fecal smells usually exuded by the Guadalcanal jungle. This seemed a good omen to the sailors. Lee badly wanted exact intelligence of the enemy. Light cruiser Sendai of Rear Admiral Hashimoto's advance screen had sighted him at 10:10 p.m. The Japanese, with their excellent night binoculars, usually picked us up first. Kondo now adopted a typically Japanese battle plan, splitting his 14-ship task force 4 ways, moving up big units at flank speed while Sendai shadowed Lee. The battle opened at 11:17 p.m. when Lee, steering westerly from Iron Bottom Sound toward its southern entrance, opened fire on Sendai. The Americans missed, and Sendai doubled back to the northward. Next, the destroyers in Lee's van encountered 2 Japanese destroyers, steaming so close to Savo Island that American radar was useless. The ensuing destroyer duel was disastrous to the Americans. Both Preston and Walker were sunk, and the other 2 went out of action. Lee pressed on with 2 battleships only, his men tossing out life rafts to the destroyer sailors as they passed over their ships' graves. Captain Gatch was back on the bridge of South Dakota, but his luck and hers had run out. At the worst possible moment she suffered an electrical power failure, so that she was little help to Lee, except that she absorbed numerous hits which might have crippled his other battleship. Washington, superbly handled by Captain Glenn Davis, picked up Kirishima on her radar, and at midnight opened up on her at 8,400 yards range. 9 of her 75 16-inch shells and 45-inch shells scored, and within 7 minutes the Japanese battleship, steering gear wrecked and topsides aflame, was out of the battle. Admiral Lee now directed Lone Washington to the northwestward to draw off the enemy cruisers and destroyers that were punishing South Dakota, and succeeded in so doing. At 12:25 a.m. Kondo decided he had had enough, and retired. Washington and South Dakota rejoined south of Guadalcanal at 9 a.m. Helpless Kirishima had already been scuttled. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, which opened on the afternoon of November 12, was over by 1 a.m. on the 15th. This night, battleship action was vastly better fought by the United States Navy than the unorganized brawl of 2 nights earlier. Admiral Lee had a positive doctrine that he maintained, despite the loss of his entire destroyer screen. He made quick, accurate analyses from the information on his radar screen. Washington, conned by Captain Glenn Davis and directed by Admiral Lee with a skill and imperturbability worthy of her eponym, saved the day for the United States. The conclusion of this great battle marked a definite shift for America from defensive to offensive, and for Japan one in the opposite direction. Fortune now for the first time smiled on the Allies everywhere, not only here but in North Africa, at Stalingrad and in Papua. President Roosevelt, while mourning the loss of his friend Dan Callaghan, announced, "It would seem that the turning point in this war has at last been reached." Churchill chose this moment to proclaim the end of the beginning. And a captured Japanese document admitted, "It must be said that the success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal Island, and the vital naval battle related to it, is the fork in the road which leads to victory for them or for us." From 15 November 1942 until 15 August 1945, the war followed the right fork. It was rough, tough, and uncharted, but it led to Tokyo. After losing the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, the Japanese Navy proposed to abandon the island. Tojo, having switched his major South Pacific objective from New Guinea to the Solomons, refused to change back. So the struggle continued. Captain Morton L. Deo of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Staff wrote a trenchant memorandum to Admiral Nimitz on 10 October, commenting on the defeat at Savo Island and the far from satisfactory events that followed. He declared that unrealistic training of our destroyers and cruisers and the almost exclusive employment of them in escort of convoy had prevented the development of a tough offensive spirit. He suggested the formation of a cruiser-destroyer group in the South Pacific to be given a solid month of training, especially night fighting, and then thrown up the slot to break up the Tokyo expresses. Belatedly, Admiral Halsey did just that, about a week after the naval battle of Guadalcanal. He appointed Rear Admiral Kinkaid commander of a new striking force, composed of heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, Pensacola, New Orleans and Northampton, light cruiser Honolulu, and 4 to 6 destroyers, based at Second Channel, Espiritu Santo. Kinkaid took command 24 November, before the task force had all been collected, worked up an operation plan, conferred with the officers, and then was detached by Admiral Nimitz. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet wanted Kinkaid to command the North Pacific Force based on Dutch Harbour, where Fuzzy Theobald was making a mess of things. As commander of the striking force, Kinkaid was relieved by Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright, to whose unhappy lot it fell on the second day of his command, to lead his yet untrained task force against a Tokyo Express led by the redoubtable Tanaka. This Japanese reinforcement plan was comparatively modest. Tanaka's force, consisting of destroyers only, would dash into Iron Bottom Sound and off Tassafaronga, would jettison rubber-wrapped drums of provisions, shove troops overboard to be recovered by small craft operating from the shore, and quickly retire. On this particular night, Tanaka had 6 destroyers crammed with troops and supplies, and 2 more not so encumbered. At 10:25 p.m. November 30, before arriving off Tassafaronga, he encountered Admiral Wright's much stronger task force. The ensuing battle reflected slight credit on the United States Navy, but great luster on the Imperial Navy of Japan. The surface of Iron Bottom Sound that calm night was like a black mirror, and the American float planes detailed to illuminate Tokyo Express were unable to rise from the water. But Wright had the advantage of radar, and destroyer Fletcher in his van had the latest kind. At 11:16 p.m. she picked up Tanaka's force, broad on the port bow, steaming slowly along the Guadalcanal shore toward the dumping-off place. The squadron commander in Fletcher asked permission for his 4 van destroyers to fire torpedoes. Wright hesitated for 4 minutes before granting it, and so lost the battle. For, by the time the torpedoes were launched, about 11:21 p.m., the Japanese column had passed the Americans on a contrary course, and the range was too great for American torpedoes to overtake them. Immediately after his last torpedo smacked the water, Wright ordered cruisers to open gunfire, and the flashes of his guns sparked off Tanaka's reaction. Despite initial handicaps of surprise, cluttered decks and enemy gunfire, Tanaka's disciplined crews in the first moments of battle managed to launch more than 20 fast-running torpedoes, and a large share of the American gunfire concentrated on one Japanese destroyer, Takanami, the only enemy ship sunk in this battle. Not one American torpedo found its target, but at 11:27 p.m. the Japanese long lances began to rip the bowels of Wright's cruisers. Minneapolis took 2 violent explosions and was out of the fight. New Orleans, maneuvering to avoid her, ran smack into another torpedo that sliced off her bow and everything up to No. 2 turret. Pensacola, turning to port to avoid her 2 burning sisters, became silhouetted by them for the enemy's benefit and took a torpedo hit directly below her mainmast, which became a torch blazing with oil from a ruptured fuel tank. Honolulu escaped by smart seamanship on the part of the officer of the deck, Lieutenant Commander George F. Davis. Northampton, after firing 18 salvos from her 8-inch battery, took 2 torpedo hits and sank after more than 3 hours' frantic efforts by damage control to save her. By 1:30 a.m. December 1, all Japanese ships except sinking Takanami were hightailing out of Iron Bottom Sound, undamaged. The 3 stricken heavy cruisers, saved by remarkable energy and ingenuity of their crews, were sent to major bases for repairs, and joined the fleet again by next fall. But it is painfully true that the Battle of Tassafaronga was a sharp defeat, inflicted on an alerted and superior cruiser force by a surprised and inferior destroyer force, whose decks were cluttered with freight. Tanaka was prevented from delivering the goods, and that was held against him by the higher command. By 3 December, this remarkable flag officer was ready for another reinforcement dash into the Sound. General Imamura, who had succeeded to the top army command at Rabaul, now had some 60,000 troops and planned to get 2 divisions of them into Guadalcanal. Successful runs were made on the nights of 3 and 4, 7 and 8, and 11 to 12 December, hampered but not defeated by PT boats based at Tulagi. PT-59, Lieutenant John M. Searles, sank a 2,000-ton blockade-running submarine I-3 on the 9th, and 3 PTs, commanded by Lieutenant Lester H. Gamble, sank Tanaka's newest flagship, destroyer Teruzuki, on the 12th. Japan had good reason to be proud of her destroyers, and their success was well earned. For 40 years, the Imperial Navy had put much thought and great effort into improved torpedoes, night fighting, and torpedo tactics. The 2,300-ton Fubuki-class destroyer, such as those of Tanaka's squadron, were equipped with 9 torpedo tubes fitted for the deadly long lances. The crews were trained to reload them in a matter of minutes, and the commanding officers were all torpedo experts. American and British destroyers enjoyed no comparable material, technique, or training. Nevertheless, faulty tactics and stupid strategy doomed to failure Japan's effort to hold Guadalcanal. During the last weeks of November and the 1st of December, Allied forces on the island were both relieved and increased. The 1st Marine Division, which had fought almost incessantly for 17 seven-day weeks, was relieved by 2 regiments of the 2nd Marine Division. The balance of the Americal Division came up, and its commander, Major General Alexander M. Patch, relieved General Vandergrift on 9 December. During the rest of December, the Japanese refrained from sending anything but submarines to relieve their now starving Guadalcanal garrison. But they were building a new launching platform at Munda in the Central Solomons for more and shorter air thrusts against Guadalcanal. It was constructed, very cannily, in a large coconut plantation, the trees being kept standing until the last minute. By 5 December, a 2,000-foot runway was ready. Since air bombing did not seem to stop the Japanese beavers, Halsey ordered bombardment missions on Munda by light cruisers and destroyers, beginning on the night of 4 January 1943. On that very day, Tojo decided to evacuate Guadalcanal, but this decision was imparted only to the top Japanese commanders and remained unknown to Allied forces until the operation was completed. A Tokyo Express run on the night of 10 and 11 January 1943 cost us 2 PT boats and the Japanese a destroyer. On the night of 14 to 15 January, Rear Admiral Koyanagi, Tanaka's relief, led down the Slot 9 destroyers, with a rear guard to cover the Japanese evacuation, and delivered it. By 23 January, aerial reconnaissance had reported a large number of transports, freighters and destroyers at Rabaul and Buin, and carriers and battleships milling around Ontong, Java, north of Guadalcanal. These were preparations for the final evacuation, but Admiral Halsey, assuming that they meant another major attempt at reinforcement, sent up 4 loaded transports powerfully covered and escorted in the hope to tempting Yamamoto to another naval battle. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet declined the gambit, but, with the new Munda airfield as base, he laid on 2 successful bombing attacks which cost us the only heavy cruiser which had survived the Battle of Savo Island. Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen's covering group for the reinforcement echelon comprised heavy cruisers, Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 of the Sangamon-class escort carriers, which had demonstrated their worth off Casablanca. Ike Giffen, a tough, colourful officer, had had slight experience in dealing with enemy aircraft. Thus, when Japanese torpedo bombers jumped his task force in the twilight of 29 January, he was in a bad formation to meet air attack. His ships had no orders what to do, and worst of all, he had left his escort carriers behind in order to meet an unimportant rendezvous, so had no air cover. He plugged doggedly ahead, trusting to anti-aircraft fire alone, while the Japanese aviators pressed their attacks repeatedly. At 1945, Chicago was hit and went dead in the water. Giffen then countermarched. Louisville Captain C. Turner Joy took the stricken cruiser in tow, and escorted by 6 destroyers, headed south at slow speed. At 4 p.m. January 30, the Japanese caught up with them. Crippled Chicago now had air cover from Enterprise, which Admiral Halsey had ordered up. But the combat air patrol provided by Big E was not strong enough to protect an almost stationary target. At a point a few miles east of Rennell Island, 9 torpedo-toting Bettys ganged up on Chicago and put 4 fish into her already damaged starboard side. She sank in 20 minutes. This Battle of Rennell Island was the last of 7 naval battles of the Guadalcanal campaign. The American transports unloaded troops and materiel at Lunga Point without molestation, as did a second convoy of 5 transports which arrived 4 February 1943. By that time, the Japanese were almost out of Guadalcanal. They had chosen the night of 1 to 2 February to begin the final evacuation, which had been going on in driblets for 2 or 3 weeks. American aircraft and destroyers and PTs were dispatched, and a minefield was laid to stop these ships, which Admiral Halsey and General Patch still believed to be bringing troops in, not taking them out. 2 more echelons, on the nights of 4 to 5 and 5 to 6 February, completed the job of removing over 11,000 men. American ground forces never realized what had happened until 9 February, when they covered the entire western end of the island without finding one living Japanese. That afternoon, General Patch radioed to Admiral Halsey. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effected today. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal, so now 2,500 square miles of miasmic plain and savage jungle-covered mountains were in American hands after 6 months of toil and suffering. The American ground force losses were not great. The Japanese lost far more heavily. The number of sailors lost on each side in the sea battles, the aviators lost over the Slot, the Sound and Henderson Field, have never been computed. Exactly 24 combatant ships, exclusive of PTs, patrol craft, auxiliaries and transports, were lost by each side. Tactically, Guadalcanal was a profitable lesson book for the United States Navy, Army and Marine Corps. Strategically, it stopped the enemy in his many-taloned reach for the Antipodes and concluded task number 1 of Operation Watchtower, an arduous climb to Rabaul. Guadalcanal should ever remain a proud name in American military history, recalling desperate fights in the air, furious night naval battles, frantic work at supply or construction, savage fighting in a sodden jungle, nights broken by screaming bombs and the explosion of naval shells. Hail to all who fell, the jagged cone of Savo Island, forever brooding over the once blood-thickened waters of Iron Bottom Sound, stands as a perpetual monument to the men and ships who here rolled back the enemy tide. In the Pacific, the British too were at war with Japan, but they could contribute only to land operations in Burma and India, leaving the naval warfare to the United States. In the European theatre, however, England was the senior partner. She had been fighting Germany and Italy since 1939 to 1940, most of the time alone. She had taken a terrific beating without flinching, and knew the weight of German might. This naturally gave her a great advantage in strategic discussions. Whilst China remained the great enigma in the Pacific, in the European theatre it was Soviet Russia. She had been fighting Germany from the summer of 1941, when Hitler decided to strike her down before resuming his blitz on England. When America entered the war, only the British in North Africa and the Russians were actually engaging the German army. It was therefore a prime necessity for the Western Allies to keep Russia fighting until they were ready to establish a second front in the West. To get help to Russia, Britain and the United States at great sacrifice maintained convoys to Murmansk and Archangel. These were a Royal Navy responsibility, but about half the merchant ships and an even greater proportion of the cargoes were American. Convoy PQ-17, the worst damaged, lost 22 out of 33 ships to U-boats and Norway-based German dive bombers in July 1942. Freighters charged with Lend-Lease goods for Russia were also being sent around the Cape of Good Hope to ports on the Persian Gulf, and other cargoes in Soviet-flagged ships, cautiously let alone by the Japanese, were crossing the Pacific to Vladivostok. But Russia, demanding more, had mobilized left-wing opinions in England and the United States behind the cry, "A second front now." The British Chiefs of Staff and Winston Churchill set their faces firmly against any premature invasion of the continent, and with good reason. Thrice in this war, from Norway, Greece and Dunkirk, they had been thrown out of the continent. Next time they went in, they wished to be certain to stay. England, by early 1942, had mobilized almost her entire manpower, which added up to a small army but a first-rate navy. So why not use the navy to carry commandos on distant, peripheral operations until such time as the Allies had the requisite men and weapons for a massive invasion of the continent. Churchill called this strategy tightening the ring. England's tradition was behind it. She had got at Napoleon by the back door of Spain, and Churchill always believed that his Gallipoli strategy, if implemented by proper amphibious tactics, could have defeated Germany in World War I. That was the only major war since Marlborough's time when England had gone into the continent in a big way, and it had led to useless losses which all responsible Englishmen were determined not to repeat. Finally, the Royal Air Force was a convert to the Douhet-Billy-Mitchell theory that the quick way to win a modern war was to bomb the hell out of your enemy's civilian population, destroy their homes and their morale. While Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff were not entirely convinced that this could be done against Germany, they were determined to give it a good try. The British, accordingly, concluded that it would make no sense to invade the continent in 1942, perhaps to revive the agony of trench warfare, as long as there was any chance of persuading the Germans by other means into rising against Hitler and demanding peace. With the policy of bombing Germany into submission, General H. Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, was thoroughly in accord. But the other American service heads favoured a direct approach by ground forces and began pressing for a massive cross-channel operation to establish an army in France, thence to strike into the heart of Germany. The British admitted that this would have to be done eventually, but hoped to make it as painless as possible after a long stretch of bleeding Germany to death by air bombing and jabs around the periphery. This basic difference in British and American strategic thinking was never really resolved until victory crowned the necessary compromise. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially Marshall and King, continued to work for long-range commitments and a war of massed power aimed at the enemy's heart. The British Chiefs of Staff, always hoping that something would turn up to render a major continental campaign unnecessary, argued for a strategy of opportunism, attrition, and peripheral attacks. It had been agreed in March 1941 that Germany was to be number one enemy, even if Japan came in, but nothing had been decided as to how enemy number one was to be beaten. That was debated at the 3 weeks Arcadia Conference of the Combined Chiefs of Staff with President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in Washington in December 1941 and January 1942. Churchill came over with a plan in his pocket, of which the essence was: first, continue all possible material aid to Russia; 2, clear Axis forces out of Libya; and 3, invade Morocco and Algeria to clear Axis forces out of the rest of North Africa. This last, he argued, was essential, and Mr. Churchill finally had his wish, tough not without a great deal of argument by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the direct approach. His 3-week stay at the White House, interrupted only by short trips to Canada and Florida, was beneficial for Anglo-American cooperation. The two leaders had met but once before, briefly at Argentia. They now had an opportunity to thrash things out and take each other's measure. In many ways, Roosevelt and Churchill were extraordinarily alike. It has been well said that each had more in common with the other than with his military advisers. But there was one essential difference. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not pretend to be an authority on military strategy. The Prime Minister Churchill did. Just as Jefferson Davis felt he knew more about strategy than Johnston or Lee, because he had been an officer in the Mexican War. So Churchill felt that his service in Queen Victoria's army, and subsequently as First Lord of His Majesty's Admiralty, made him an authority on strategy. It was often difficult for the British Chiefs of Staff to dissuade him from carrying out some of his peripheral plans for landing in Norway, Dakar, Rhodes, and so on. Roosevelt, too, would have enjoyed romantic military adventures, but he had a natural common sense on strategy, and his military advisers kept him on the straight and narrow. Both men were political maestros, adept at creating and using public opinion, and both had to deal with the opposition inevitable under democratic governments. Both, but Roosevelt to the greater extent, were regarded as traitors to their class, and hated by the sort of people with whom they had grown up. But both had the enthusiastic support of the masses. Never has there been such a team in coalition warfare as Winnie and Franklin Delano Roosevelt compared with the relations between these two. The principal protagonists in World War I, Lloyd George, Wilson, and Clemenceau, were mutually suspicious strangers, and Hitler and Mussolini were a pair of gangsters, each fearing the other would win the most loot. Before the Arcadia Conference met at Washington, the United States Army planners, led by General Embick, a member of the Supreme War Council during the First World War, had been doing some intensive thinking on ways and means of defeating Germany. After considering every possible method of getting at the heart of the Reich, they reached the conviction that the only way was to mount a large-scale Anglo-American assault in the British Isles and throw it across the Channel, the sooner the better. They were willing to contemplate small peripheral operations to blood American troops and do something while preparing for the Great Push, but they opposed, as long as they could, a large-scale invasion of North Africa as a diversion which would draw off forces needed for the invasion of Hitler's heartland. The Arcadia Conference disbanded 14 January 1942 without deciding on any campaign for that year. But the British and American Joint Staffs continued planning as if the North African invasion would come off in May or June. The series of disasters in the Far East, the U-boat blitz, and the victories of Rommel over Auchinleck in Libya made this timetable impossible to keep, and on 3 March the combined Chiefs of Staff agreed to scrap it. In view of the beatings the Allies had already taken in Europe and in Asia, any invasion of North Africa must be done in sufficient force to ensure success. But where was the force to come from? The British agreed that we must place garrisons in Noumea, Fiji, Johnston and Palmyra Islands to guard the lifeline to Australia, and shipping was in short supply, shortly to become shorter thanks to the U-boats. On the combined Chiefs of Staff agenda, North Africa was now replaced by what was known as the Marshall Memorandum. This was a plan for 1. A cross-channel beachhead to be established in Normandy in 1942, Operation Sledgehammer, to be followed by 2. An all-out cross-channel offensive in 1943, Operation Roundup, and a push across the Rhine. This plan was accepted in principle by the British Chiefs of Staff on 14 April, after General Marshall and Harry Hopkins had gone to England especially to sell it. But, as Marshall realised, this was not, from the British point of view, a firm commitment. The more they looked at it, the less they liked it, especially the 1942 curtain raiser. In any cross-channel movement that early, the major part of the troops would have to be British, so the United States could not insist. Large numbers of landing craft would be required, and although in the United States, Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet was established with a training center at Little Creek, Virginia, and a construction program for tow 1,500 craft for Sledgehammer and 8,200 for Roundup was set up on 4 April. These had to compete with so many other urgent shipbuilding demands that the target date could not possibly be met. In May and June, events came thick and fast. Molotov visited both Churchill and Roosevelt to plead for a second front. Rommel captured Tobruk, which rendered action in North Africa urgent, and the War and Navy departments made frantic efforts to get more tanks and planes to the British in Egypt and to the Russians by the dangerous Murmansk route. Churchill visited Washington again in June to tell Roosevelt flatly that England could not and would not undertake a cross-channel operation in 1942. That opened a crisis in Anglo-American relations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially Admiral King and General Marshall, felt that if the British would not set a firm date for a major invasion of Europe, we were entitled to renege on the Beat Germany First decision of 1941. This was to stop preparing for an invasion that might never take place and concentrate on the Pacific War. This proposed right-about-face in strategy would greatly have pleased General MacArthur, who in a long message to General Marshall of 8 May 1942 argued seriously that the Second Front should be established under his own command in the Pacific, where it would take the heat off Russia by seriously engaging the armies of Japan. But Japan was not then at war with Russia, nor would be until August 1945. Not only MacArthur, but King, Marshall and Secretary Stimson strongly opposed the launching of a North African invasion in 1942, as certain to divert and absorb men, ships, aircraft and material that would postpone the direct cross-channel assault indefinitely. The President himself decided that to turn our backs on Europe was too drastic. Before Churchill left Washington, they had convinced each other that something formidable must be laid on in the Atlantic theatre for 1942. Since the British would not accept Sledgehammer, an invasion of North Africa was the only practical alternative. On 24 July 1942, the combined chiefs of staff in London voted timidly and tentatively for Operation Torch, a simultaneous occupation of Morocco and Algeria, but to postpone a definite decision until mid-September. President Roosevelt, sick of this wrangling and procrastination, used his authority as Commander-in-Chief Army and Navy to make it definite next day. Churchill, naturally, accepted what he had wanted all along. On the 26th, General Marshall informed General Eisenhower that he was to be Commander-in-Chief Allied Expeditionary Force in North Africa. The torch was lit. This torch decision was one of the most momentous in the war. It set up what was supposed to be only a secondary front, but the force of logic, the natural desire to build on foundations that have already cost one dear, pulled more and more Allied forces into the Mediterranean theatre, over 1 million Americans alone. In consequence, the cross-channel operation was impossible before 1944, and we came measurably close to having it postponed another year. At this time, the Vichy government of France was in control of French Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. No de Gaullist movement had developed there, and no German armed forces were in occupation. Spanish Morocco, opposite Gibraltar, was under Franco's control and so neutral. Libya or Tripolitana, the Italian colony between Tunisia and Egypt, was the battleground between Rommel and Auchinleck, who checked the Germans at the First Battle of El Alamein on 2 July, and was then relieved by the colourful Montgomery, because Churchill felt that Auchinleck had not done well enough. Egypt, nominally independent, was still under strong British occupation and control. On the north side of the Mediterranean, Gibraltar was British, Spain neutral, southern France neutral under Vichy. Italy, the Balkans and Greece were under Axis control. Malta, after a heroic defence, held firm, and continued an indispensable strategic base for the Allies, and a thorn in the Axis. The declared objectives of Operation Torch were to gain control over French Morocco, where the one modern port, Casablanca, offered an excellent base for anti-submarine warfare, and of Algeria and Tunisia as bases for further operations against the Axis. Planning began immediately at combined headquarters in Norfolk House, London. General Eisenhower arrived there in early August. Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham was appointed Allied Naval Commander. D-Day was set for 8 November, the very latest date in the fall when amphibious landings on the iron-bound outer coast of Morocco were considered possible. The entire operation was broken down as follows: 1 Western Naval Task Force, Rear Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, lifting and covering Western Task Force United States Army, Major General George F. Patton, consisting initially of about 35,000 troops. This all-American section of Torch was mounted at Norfolk, Virginia. Owing to its geographical separation from the rest of the operation, Western Naval Task Force was given a free hand by Eisenhower and Cunningham. It was divided in 3 groups for as many separate landings. Northern, Rear Admiral Monroe Kelly, to land at Mehedia and thrust up the Wadi Sebu to Port Lyautey. Centre, Captain Robert R. M. Emmett, to land at Fedhala near Casablanca, and Southern, Rear Admiral Lyall A. Davidson, to land at Safi. 2. Centre Naval Task Force, escorted and covered by the Royal Navy, about 39,000 American ground forces, mounted in the United Kingdom, to capture Oran in Algeria. 3. Eastern Naval Task Force, about 23,000 British and 10,000 American troops, mounted in the United Kingdom, escorted and covered by the Royal Navy, to capture Algiers. We shall have most to say about the Western Naval Task Force, as it was all American, and many of its doings were original, almost fantastic. Except for the landings at Guadalcanal in August, this was the first amphibious operation conducted by the United States in 45 years. And it is no exaggeration to say that it was one of the boldest ever undertaken. Amphibious operations are divided into 2 main categories, of which the most common is the shore-to-shore. In this, the troops are lifted a short distance in landing or beaching craft, which take them directly to the beaches, as for instance in Operation Neptune Overlord, the great cross-channel movement of June 1944. In the other kind, ship-to-shore, of which Torch is a good example, the troops are lifted over long distances in transports and put ashore in small landing craft that the big ships carry on deck. This was the first time in history that a ship-to-shore operation had been projected across an ocean. It was extremely risky. There was danger of attack by the yet unmastered U-boats during the ocean passage and while unloading. There was danger from high surf at the target. All landing places faced the Atlantic surges. The beaches selected were commanded by coast defence guns. The French had plenty of ground, air and naval forces to defend their positions in Morocco, and nobody knew what their attitude would be. Secret diplomacy had been at work for months to persuade the French there to welcome us as liberators. But they were all under command of Marshal Pétain at Vichy, and nobody knew whether he would respond to German pressure or to Allied persuasion. One of the most amazing things about this bold operation was the secrecy with which so great an expeditionary force, 107 sail in the Western Task Force alone, and even more in the two others, was assembled and transported. The Germans knew that something was in the wind, but never guessed what. Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force they knew nothing of, and by careful work with high-frequency direction finder, the Navy was able to spot all U-boats then in the Atlantic and route this great force so that it avoided them all. Nevertheless, after it arrived, some U-boats slipped silently in to make easy kills. All troops of the Western Task Force embarked at Norfolk, and with a strong naval escort sorted 23 October. The Air Group, Carrier Ranger and converted escort carriers Suwannee, Sangamon, Santee and Chenango, commanded by Rear Admiral Ernest D. McWhorter, sorted from Bermuda and joined at longitude 50° west on the 28th. There were 2 fuelings at sea, and every ship was a floating school of amphibious warfare. Nobody on board had ever participated in such an operation, and very few had even been in combat. On 7 November the sun set at 5:45 p.m., and enough stars appeared for a fix. At 11 p.m. Commander James M. Lane, navigator of Brooklyn, in which your historian sailed, announced that we were closing High Barbary. Africa was never so dark and mysterious to ancient sea rovers as she seemed that night, veiled in clouds and hushed in slumber. Not a light gleamed, not a dog barked, but the wind came offshore, blowing out to the ships the smell of charcoal smoke and of parched dry grass. What countless stratagems of this sort have been practised on this very coast since remotest antiquity. We might have been Portuguese caravels, with sails furled and yards on deck, waiting for the pole star clock to register 2 hours before dawn to move in and slaughter infidels. It has always been thus. You want a couple of hours' darkness to land and surprise the enemy, and then daybreak, so you can tell friend from foe, gold from brass, and wench from wife. At a quarter hour before midnight, flagship Augusta signalled stop, and the transports coasted into their planned unloading positions off Cape Fedala, 8 minutes in advance of schedule. Before 8 bells ushered in 8 November, one could hear the clank and clash which told one that the transports were already lowering landing craft. An hour passed. Assault troops were now leaping ashore, rifles in hand, running up the beach and striking for their first objectives. A searchlight shot up from ashore, and then another. The French had heard the humming of landing craft engines and thought they were planes. At morning twilight, Brooklyn moved toward her fire support position to knock out a powerful coast defense battery known to Americans as the Cherokee. It and other shore batteries opened fire on us. A few moments later, there came over the air from the flagship Admiral Hewitt's long-anticipated signal for a general engagement. Playball, this little corner of the world, so dark and silent for 5 long hours, was now split with blinding gun flashes, shattered by machine gun fire, shaken by the crash of heavy ordnance. It was essential to silence batteries at each end of Fedala as they enfiladed the beaches and their approaches. Brooklyn scored a direct hit on one of the 4 guns at Cherokee and another on the fire control station. Ground troops then moved in. The batteries on Cape Fedala were harder to find and still more difficult to knock out. They opened up intermittently on the landing craft and killed several men. But the landings went on, wave after wave of small craft, until by 5 p.m. on D-Day, 8 November, 7,750 officers and men were ashore. French resistance here was almost nil, but surf, a falling tide and inexperienced crews brought heavy damage to landing craft. Some 150 out of a total of 350 were expended. From 6:15 a.m., when it was barely light enough to launch planes, the Navy's carrier-based aircraft began to fight. Rangers Wildcats destroyed grounded planes at the 3 principal French airdromes in Morocco, while her dive bombers hit the submarine basin in Casablanca harbour. and both took part in the naval actions we are about to relate. Suwannee, commanded by Captain Jocko Clark, handled combat air and anti-submarine patrol for the Centre Group. Shortly after 7 a.m. opened the first phase of the naval Battle of Casablanca. This was a fight between Admiral Giffin's covering group, battleship Massachusetts, heavy cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, and 4 8-inch coast defense guns of El Hank Battery near the Casablanca lighthouse, aided by French battleship Jean Bart immobilized in the harbour. The shore battery was only silenced temporarily, but Jean Bart, whose 4 15-inch guns might have raised havoc in the transport area off Fedallah, was silenced for the day. The next phase began at 8:15 a.m. when Contre-Amiral Michelier, commanding French naval forces at Casablanca, took advantage of a moment when Giffin's big ships were 16 miles offshore to hurl his 7 destroyers at the American transports. Even at this late hour, the French did not know whether the ships landing troops on their soil were German, British, or American, and they didn't much care. The French Navy's honour was at stake. It was determined to fight. The sortying destroyers made a few hits on landing craft and destroyer Ludlow, but before they could reach the vulnerable transports, they were engaged by Augusta, Brooklyn, and 2 destroyers. The French ships, led by Contre-Amiral Gervais de Lafont in destroyer leader Milan, put up a stout and clever fight, laying a thick smokescreen in and out of which they dodged to shoot. But they were too few and feebly armed, even when assisted by light cruiser Primogay, and by 8 submarines which had escaped the earlier bombardment of their mooring basin. American gunfire was faster, heavier, and more accurate, and carrier-based aircraft had command of the air. Destroyers Fougueux and Boulonnais blew up and sank. Primogay took a bad beating from the cruiser's gunfire, and was later finished off by air bombing. Brestois and Frondeur met the same fate. A hit by El Hank Battery on Wichita, which wounded 14 men, was the only lethal one received by the American ships before action broke off at 11:45 a.m. The final score for this day of battle was very one-sided, but by the day's end the French Navy had plenty of fight left. El Hank was still intact, and the 15-inch guns of Jean Bart were again ready for action. The objective of the Northern Attack Group, commanded by Rear Admiral Kelly in battleship Texas and carrying about 9,000 men, mostly of the 9th Infantry Division under General Truscott, was to capture the important airdrome of Port Lyautey, several miles up the shoal and winding Wadi Sebu. Escort carrier Sangamon carried the fighter and bomber components, and her sister ship Chenango stood by waiting for a chance to fly army planes to the airdromes. It was assumed that the town of Mehdia, with an ancient but well-fortified Kasbah citadel at the mouth of the Cebu, must be taken before the river could be used. The Kasbah took the initiative at 7 a.m., shelling boat waves and transports, forcing transports to pull out to a point some 15 miles offshore. The result, as General Truscott reported, was that the landings were turned into a hit-or-miss affair, which would have spelled disaster against a determined enemy. The French here were too strong, some 3,500 Moroccan Zirailleurs and foreign legionnaires and 14 tanks, and were alerted too early, and our troops got ashore too late to have a walkover as at Fedallah. The Kasbah, despite efforts of cruiser Savannah, did not fall until 10 November, and then to the army, the leading naval exploit. Of this attack was the gallant passage of destroyer Dallas. Lieutenant Commander Robert Brodie, a 22-year-old four-piper, up the Cebu. After her net-cutting party had severed the stout wire of the boom at the river mouth, Dallas, carrying a raider detachment of 75 men and guided by a local French pilot, crashed through the rest of the boom at first light 10 November. Under fire from the Kasbah, threaded her way between sunken hulks, dragged her keel through the soft mud of the river bottom, silenced French guns that fired at her, and landed her raiders without a casualty. Cooperating with a battalion of the 2nd Armoured Division United States Army, which marched overland, the raiders captured the airdrome in short order, and by 10:30 a.m. it was being used by P-40s from Chenango. Everything clicked in the southern attack on Safi, a little town at a gap in the cliffs 150 miles south of Casablanca, where the French had constructed a small artificial harbour. It was selected as objective partly to box off French forces in southern Morocco, but mainly as the one place to land tanks. One quay in the harbour was long enough and the water alongside deep enough to berth tank carrier Lakehurst, a converted sea train. She had to be used, as no landing ship tank had been completed in time to take part in this operation. There was no other harbour in Morocco that she could enter, except Casablanca, and it was for the capture of Casablanca that these tanks were wanted. The harbour and all possible beaches were well covered by French artillery. To permit Lakehurst to enter and discharge her tanks, two 1919 vintage destroyers, Bernadou, Lieutenant Commander R.E. Brady and Lieutenant Commander G.G. Palmer, were shorn of most of their superstructures and loaded with 350 assault troops to rush into the harbour and take it over before daylight. It worked. Bernadou, guided by Ensign J.J. Bell in a rubber scout boat, was just entering the harbour for November 8 when the French shore artillery started giving her the works. Cruiser Philadelphia and battleship New York then started throwing 6-inch and 14-inch shells at the Batterie Raileuse, four 130mm coast defence guns north of the town, which was making most of the trouble. Bernadou miraculously came through unhurt, sweeping the jetties and piers with machine gun fire, and grounded near the harbour head. Her assault troops clambered down landing nets onto the rocks, and a few minutes later were chasing foreign legionnaires away from the water's edge. Cole followed with landing craft trailing and tied up at a quay. The town of Safi was captured by the raiders. Marrakech Airdrome was neutralised by flyers from escort carrier Santee, and in the afternoon Sea Train Lakehurst made a dignified entry and began discharging tanks. They started rumbling along the road to Casablanca on 10 November, but before they had got very far, word came through from Admiral Darlan that this little Franco-American war was over.